So we've talked about in New York, printmaking was being developed through the Art Students League and Atelier 17 and the WPA funded programs. But over on the West Coast, there was a guy named Herbert Jepsen, and he taught at an art school called Chouinard Art Institute. Now, Chouinard was highly esteemed. Walt Disney in the 30s would bring his young animators to Chouinard on Friday nights for art classes, and he even ended up using Chouinard students for the development of Snow White. But in '45, Jepsen decided he was going to leave Chouinard and launch his own art school called Jepson Art Institute. And he moved Guy McCoy, remember Guy, the father of serigraphy, he moved him from New York to LA to launch the serigraphy program at his school. Now, I'm going to show you a couple prints from artists who were students at Chouinard and Jepsen. This is from an artist who studied at Chouinard named Norio Azuma. He was one of the first to experiment with serigraphy on canvas instead of paper. He spent 2 years perfecting this technique. A New York Times art critic once described one of Azuma's serigraphs as, quote, "so beautiful a manipulation of shape, color, and texture that it eliminates my lingering objections to serigraphy as a technique." This is a David Weidman print. Weidman was a student at Jepsen, and he became a Hanna-Barbera animator. Weidman isn't necessarily important in the art world, but I thought you'd find this fun. If you ever watch the show Mad Men, keep a sharp eye out and you'll see lots of Weidman prints on the set. Chouinard and Jepsen were really paving the way in printmaking education in 1945, but they were a rarity. Academic institutions with printmaking programs are really few and far between, and the ones who had programs usually had more traditional programs that focused on etching and engraving. But emerging art forms at the time, abstract expressionism and then later pop art and minimalism, those forms were really better served by serigraphy and lithography. In the late 40s and 50s, a guy named Karl Caston established the printmaking programs at a couple other West Coast schools, San Francisco State University and UC Berkeley. And his goal was really that printmaking could equal painting even through creative exploration. This is a Karl Caston print. It's an edition of 15 from a little bit later of a time period than what we're talking about right now. It's from the mid-1960s. Caston printed in the Cubist style early in his career, but later on he turned to abstract expressionism after he studied with Hans Hofmann in the 1950s. In 1948, Herbert Jepsen and Guy McCoy rallied together some Chouinard students and some Jepsen students and formed what they called the Western Serigraph Institute. Now, I've researched and tried to find more information about the WSI and come up short. I've even emailed some of the surviving children of founding members and not gotten a whole lot of information. But from what I can tell, they sponsored about 400 exhibitions over about a period of 20 years, as well as creating their own art and going around doing educational programs for the community about serigraphy. This is a print by Dorothy Bowman. She and her husband were Chouinard and Jepsen students that were also charter members of the Western Serigraph Institute. This print is called Towered Spire from 1958. Here's a print by her husband, Howard Bradford, called Riverbank. I really love the crazy energy of the trees along the bank on this one, but more often when I look at it, I see huge waves crashing on the shore. This is another Bradford from much later, 1983. This is a serigraph by R.Freeman Worthley, who served as the president of the Western Serigraph Institute for 20 years. Check out the ship on the left. You'll see it's named Ginger. Worthley's wife, Ginger Osgood, was a Jepsen student, and she served as the exhibitions director at the WSI. This is one of Ginger's Collagraph prints. Now, Collagraph printing was developed in the 50s, and it's an additive process where you're building up the printing surface by like gluing things to it or collaging elements onto it to create the areas where the ink will print. A lot of times that built up surface pressing on the paper ends up embossing it, making this really kind of cool dimensional effect. Let's take another quick break and talk about the art movements that were going on at this time. When we left off last time, we were talking about abstract expressionism and how it had sort of been developed in New York and made New York City really the new center of the art world. Now, at first, abstract expressionism was all about action and gesture and feeling and emotion. Following slightly behind the action painters were the color field artists. They used color as a powerfully expressive object to sort of create a kind of elemental emotional impact. Next came artists experimenting with hard edge abstraction. They made flat forms rimmed by like really hard, clean edges. They experimented with autonomous shapes and explored relationships between geometry and color. And for me, they sort of blend together with the minimalists. So while abstract expressionism really started out as this hot, unpredictable, and emotional thing, it gradually jettisoned all feeling and morphed into this austere, very impersonal form of artistic purity and truth. At this point, sort of pushing back against the intellectuals who were raving about the purity and truth of the circle, the pop artists reintroduced the idea of representative art. But they really sort of used mundane images from mass media and pop culture. They really challenged the idea that there was such a thing as high art and low art. So the modern art movement was changing really fast, and you'll see that reflected quite a lot over the next two sessions as we move into the period from the 1950s to the 1970s.